Hello everyone. I'm going to deliver today's presentation as an historical vignette. So sit back and enjoy the trip. Hopefully, some of the information today will be new to at least a few of you. When I first cobbled together this talk, I decided on the Queen's Gambit. If you've seen the Golden Globe winning series, then you know that Beth Harmon, the protagonist, has a remarkable ability to play chess in her head. With that in mind, as time went on, I realized the title needed a change. So I renamed the talk The Queen's Gambit Denied. The reason for the title change will be obvious in a moment, but before we start reviewing scientific literature, I'd like you all to participate in a little experiment together. Go ahead and close your eyes and think of an apple. Keep your eyes closed and now put a stem on the apple. Then, make the apple spin. Okay, that's good. Now open your eyes. If we were together here in person, I'd ask everyone, what color is the apple? We can't easily tabulate your answers today, but the last time I asked this question, these were the results. The results don't really matter. It's participating in the exercise that gives you the grounding for the first paper we are going to discuss. Let's go ahead and look at the case report that begins our story. We are going to start with the case of a 65-year-old man with a long history of detailed visualization who claimed he suddenly lost his ability to imagine an apple, or anything else. Despite his claimed inability to experience imagery, he performed normally on standard tests of perception, visual imagery, and visual memory. The patient, MX, had a coronary angiogram, and during the course of the angiogram, he experienced what he described as a reverberation in the head with left arm tingling. Distressed about his newfound loss, he visited his GP, who quickly referred him to Dr. Zeman in the Department of Neurology. The patient was certain he had a new deficit, but his examination was normal. He was very cooperative, agreeing to multiple tests for more than a year. Although he was certain he had a deficit, MX's testing initially failed to reveal any abnormality. As I said, they did do a lot of testing on MX. Here you can see his results compared with controls who were also architects. MX matched controls in the top grouping of general intelligence tests and the second grouping of memory tests. The highlighted yellow tests are the subjective questionnaires, which were the only tests where he fell far below the controls. Finally, the last group were specific imagery tests. For letters, do they have curves or do they go below the line? Well, an example imagery question would be, is the green of grass lighter or darker than that of a pine tree? For many of the imagery tests, controls were not even done because MX got near perfect scores. So, after all this testing, they had a patient who claimed a deficit, but all of his objective testing was within normal limits. Based on the incongruity of these findings, the researchers decided to look at fMRI during visual perception and imagery and try 2 additional imagery tests. Before we look at the MRI results and those of the other tests, I'd like to show you the VVIQ test that MX failed so badly, since we will see it again later. Here's a look at part of the VVIQ, or Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, developed in 1973. It consists of 4 imagined scenes, each of which has 4 specific elements. The participants subjectively rate each element on a 5-point scale, from no image to a perfectly realistic one. In total, then, there are 16 questions with a final score from 16 to 80. Let's move on and look at the functional MRI results. As you know, functional MRI indirectly measures brain activity by anatomically mapping real-time blood flow with a temporal resolution of 1 to 3 seconds. MX and the controls were first scanned during a perception task, viewing black and white images of famous faces compared to a scrambled image not recognizable as a face. For the imagery task, they were presented the name of a famous person and were asked to imagine their face, compared to viewing scrambled letters. MX activated the same areas as controls on the perception task, but on the imagery task he had different areas of activation. For the first time, Dr. Zeman's team found testing differences supporting MX's claim. Mental rotation is a widely used test for mental imagery. A pair of 10-block structures is presented to the subject, whose task is to decide as quickly as possible if the images are the same or not. The degrees rotation and the time it takes to answer are recorded. Normally, as shown in controls here, there is a linear relationship between the rotation angle between the 3D structures and how long it takes to answer the question. MX was different. He always took longer than the controls, but MX's time was not linearly related to the amount of rotation between the objects. The researchers believed that's because he was not mentally rotating the images. Note that while he took a little more time, his alternative method did get him a perfect score. MX was also given the Brooks matrix test. It is presented as an image as shown here, or verbally as in the blue text. Subjects are asked to recreate the matrix. MX did better with verbal presentation than with visual presentation, the opposite of controls. 4 weeks later, MX was retested. His visual spatial score improved to 6.8, but articulatory interference, that is, him saying the repeatedly during image presentation, dropped his score to 4.7. In normal controls, articulatory interference does not occur with visual presentation, suggesting MX had adopted a new strategy to image presentation that can be disrupted by articulation. Armed with the fMRI results and 2 objective tests that supported MX's claim, they were ready to publish. Zeman coined the term blind imagination, analogous to blind sight, when a patient claims they cannot see, but is able to avoid obstacles, for example. Zeman and colleagues described the discordant subjective and objective findings in MX's case report, raising questions about the validity of some mental imagery tests and how we think about consciousness itself. It was an interesting result in a highly specialized journal, but what happened next changed everything. You may know Carl Zimmer as the New York Times science journalist and author of She Has Her Mother's Laugh and his new release, Life's Edge. Well, Carl was working at the time at Discover when he came across Zeman's online paper. He decided to write a piece on Zeman's work, bringing it to the general public. Shortly after the Discover article, people began contacting Carl Zimmer to tell him that they had never been able to perform visual imagination. Carl forwarded their comments to Dr. Zeman, who had begun hearing the same stories. Dr. Zeman wrote a questionnaire for those who contacted him. 21 people completed the first online questionnaire, and their results were stunningly similar. It appeared that MX was not, as originally thought, a single case report, but part of a previously uncharacterized group of people. Zeman put together an online VVIQ test. He gave the test to the 21 people who initially contacted him and to 121 controls. They found 2 populations with limited overlap. These 21 people underwent additional testing and formed the basis of another paper. Probably the most consequential feature of this 2015 follow-up paper was that Zeman suggested a name, aphantasia, for the phenomenon. Carl Zimmer again popularized the results, this time with an article in the New York Times. Lives without imagery, congenital aphantasia, reached the top 1% of research output as measured by Altmetric. It turns out giving this condition a name has jump-started investigations into the cause, types and outcomes of, and associations with aphantasia. Like everything else, research into aphantasia has been slowed by the pandemic. In the experiment we conducted earlier, there was no common image that was shared by everyone. It turns out that there is considerable individual variation in the ability to even conjure up an image of an apple, let alone a stem or movement of the apple, such as making it spin. Having named aphantasia for the extreme reduction in voluntary visual imagery, the name hyperphantasia has been adopted for those people who have the opposite extreme of visual imagery, mimicking or even surpassing the true visual experience. In fact, there is wide variation in the ability to voluntarily visualize. Zeman gave the name aphantasia to the extreme condition where imagery was not a part of a person's daily life, as shown as numbers 4 and 5 in the diagram. If right now you are thinking to yourself, wait, you don't mean that people can actually see a picture in their heads, right? Then, my friend, you have aphantasia. Hyperphantasia describes those at the other end of the spectrum with a near real-life quality of voluntary visualization. To be fair, variations in visual imagery have been covered since the 1800s. Galton, a member of the Royal Society, not only created the first weather map, he also introduced questionnaires and surveys for collecting data, including a survey that formed the basis for the first paper on variations in visual imagery. Galton found a much higher incidence of low imagery in his survey of, quote, men of science, unquote, when compared with the general population. Today, we are discovering features of and associations with these extremes. Aside, Galton was a polymath who developed the statistical concept of correlation. He coined nature versus nurture. Unfortunately for him, he also coined eugenics. When the pandemic fades, these are some of the areas of anticipated research. First, it's important to define the phenomenon and find an easy, objective test for it. Questionnaires are too subjective, and fMRI is too difficult and expensive. At this point, we don't know if this is a spectrum based on genetics, development, or something else. Is it a defect? High achievers with aphantasia include Craig Venter, Oliver Sacks, and the president of Pixar, Ed Catmull. They would probably argue aphantasia didn't hinder them. A genetic component is suggested by anecdote and a 2,400-person study with a 10x odds ratio for immediate family members of someone with aphantasia. There have been early discussions with 23andMe to look for genetic correlates, although a genome-wide association study would provide more complete information. Routine brain MRI scans are normal, but there have been no DTI studies to assess the connectome, which has imaging correlates to glaucoma. With normal brain volume, we can presume that compensatory mechanisms provide functionality to mitigate any major negative impact of aphantasia, though we don't know if there are typical, common, or unique compensatory mechanisms at play. We do have evidence of associations with facial recognition and autobiographical memory. Other preliminary evidence is that aphantasia protects against PTSD and that those with hyperphantasia more steeply discount future rewards. Finally, testing aphantasia subjects may refine existing models of cognition and memory. In 2020, using data from 2,400 online respondents, some patterns have emerged. As might be expected, those with aphantasia report worse autobiographical memory and facial recognition. Surprisingly, most did report dreaming. Aphantasia was associated with STEM careers, while hyperphantasia was associated with creative arts. Both extremes were considered to have a negative impact on relationships, even as hyperphantasia was more often considered advantageous. Hyperphantasia was frequently discovered earlier, often related to art. If you want more information on aphantasia, these are the current top researchers in England and Australia, along with online resources aphantasia.com and, of course, Reddit. So there you have it, the Queen's Gambit Denied, aka aphantasia. This relatively newly appreciated phenomenon is ripe for research in several areas. I'm happy to take any of your questions. Please give me a moment to switch to live audio. Thank you.